Good evening, and welcome to the Institute of Politics Journalism Week event, Pizza with Podcasters, Know Your Enemy in Conversation with Crooked Media's Reid Cherlin. My name is Ava Partridge, and I'm a third-year student in the college from Washington, D.C., studying political science and religious studies. At the IOP, I'm a Communications House intern, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Gate, our undergraduate political review. As a student journalist and avid podcast consumer, I'm excited that we're hosting this event to explore the role of podcasting in political journalism and the media environment of today. I also have an academic interest in understanding conservative movements, so I'm excited to hear from our guests about their lens on today's conservatism. Tonight, we are joined by the hosts of the Know Your Enemy podcast, Matthew Sitman and Sam Adler-Bell. Matthew Sitman, a self-described recovered conservative, has been the co-host of the Know Your Enemy podcast since he and Adler-Bell started recording in 2019. He has also been an associate editor at Commonweal, a journal of opinion on politics, religion, and culture, and he currently sits on the editorial board for Dissent magazine. Sam Adler-Bell, also a founder and co-host of Know Your Enemy, has made his career in both journalism and policy, writing and researching on economic justice and surveillance before starting Know Your Enemy. He also developed and led viral campaigns with demand progress on issues relating to tech, civil liberties, and campaign finance reform. Moderating our discussion today is Reid Cherlin, executive editor for news and politics at Crooked Media, home to the Pod Save franchise. He has worked as a senior producer and managing editor for podcasts at NBC News, and he was assistant press secretary in the Obama White House after working on many political campaigns. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. Please silence your cell phones, and when it is time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. Please line up and remember that priority for the first questions will go to students. This event is part of the IOP's annual David S. Broder Journalism Week, which honors the legacy of a titan of journalism and a University of Chicago alum. His columns for the Washington Post on the Watergate scandal inspired his nickname Dean of the Press Corps and earned him the 1973 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. Please check out our final Journalism Week event, the Frenzied First 100 Days, covering Trump in unprecedented waters, this Friday at 12:30 at International House, which will feature a panel of esteemed White House reporters. We are also thrilled to announce that on May 12th, the IOP will host Twitch streamer Hassan Piker in conversation with Ested Herndon from 5:30 to 6:45 p.m. at the David Rubenstein Forum. You can register for both events on the IOP website. Now, please join me in welcoming Matthew Sitman, Sam Adler-Bell, and Reid Cherlin.
I don't think I've ever walked out to panel walk on music, so thank you guys for having us. It's so wonderful to be here. And thank you for that lovely introduction. We were just chatting backstage, as it were. We're so happy to be here. None of us have actually been to the University of Chicago before, much to our great shame, so we're really amped to be here. Heard the weather's like this all the time.
Matt's been
You guys
here.
are lucky.
No, I was here once.
Oh, you were?
Sorry.
But he vowed never to come back.
I'm back
He's here
against
for
my
this
will.
event, so you're lucky.
Yeah. When I heard Hassan was doing an event here, I said, we'll relent.
Yeah.
Be on a panel too.
Yeah. Well, I think he heard we were doing the event
Right.
and was like, wants to draft off our audience size.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I will just recap. I'm Reid Cherlin from Crooked Media. Thanks for the hoot. Job title aside, what I actually do all day is I work on Pod Save America. Thank you, whoever you are. I help shape what we're going to cover and help write the show a couple times a week when we record it. It's not really a written show on the ear, but there's a lot of information that goes into the prompts, and so it's a lot of reading the news and synthesizing the news, same kind of thing that I imagine you guys do. So can you just tell us a little bit about, just refresh your names and how you go about making the podcast?
Do you want me to start, Sam?
Yes.
I do start our episodes out, so I'm here with my great friend, Sam Adler-Bell. That'll be familiar to some of you.
You guys got a bigger reaction.
Yeah. And, we started this podcast, Know Your Enemy, hard to believe, but in the spring of 2019. So just about 6 years ago exactly. And I just thought, to start to answer your question, one of the things when we started it, even in 2019, we thought there was, no shortage of podcasts out there that you could listen to. And so we really wanted to have Know Your Enemy, which we didn't have a title for yet. That was Sam's doing. But we wanted it to be about something. We wanted to say, actually, this is what the podcast's about. We're not just two buddies turning on the mics and just, shooting the shit, talking about whatever.
Even though that also was what we were doing.
Yeah, even though that was, part of why we wanted to do it, we really thought the podcast had to be about something, which is the American right, the post-war, post-1945 U.S. conservatism, the conservative movement, especially the intellectuals, but it's kind of grown beyond that. We look at the right, not just in the United States, but, I think that is a first stab at your question, is we wanted it to be about something. And so, once you actually have something you want to talk about, how you go about preparing and doing it follows from that.
It's funny, I don't mean to step on you here, but I went back and I listened to your first episode.
Oh, no.
Ooh.
I know. I thought you would have that reaction, and it is a very good episode, and it really does a good job of laying out kind of what the podcast is going to be all about. But of course, there's this kind of funny crosstalk at the beginning of you guys kind of messing around with the microphones, and it's kind of like, well, I don't think anyone's ever going to hear this, and it's very winning. And when you listen now, it's like, the different tiers of the Patreon, and you guys, our loyal audience has been asking for this. It's really impressive to me. But not surprising to me how much it's grown and the kind of following that it has. And I'm going to jump off there into what I wanted to start with, actually, which was, so I did go back and listen to the first episode because I wanted to kind of refresh my memory about the mission. And it's a fascinating conversation about why bother studying the right. And it always seemed to me, so preparing to come here today, talking about the podcast at other times in my life, and then preparing especially to come here today and talking about what I was going to be doing, basically everybody says, who doesn't already know the podcast says, oh man, I gotta listen to that. And I do think there's this sort of condition of being a liberal that means you are inquisitive and you want to know, you want to understand what's happening, and you can sense that visceral appeal when people react to or talk or hear about your show. Do you think the right feels the same way about us?
I mean, the start of this answer is always there's a bit of the old saw that liberals are the people who are so broad-minded they can't take their own side in an argument. And there's a bit of that, but the flip side of that would be to say, in a more flattering way for liberals, is that we're the kind of political subject who's fearful that we're wrong. And I definitely feel that way. I mean, part of the motivation to do the podcast with Matt in the beginning was because I realized I didn't know shit. I did not know anything about the right, really, about this history. I didn't read these books in school. I grew up in a left liberal environment. It was totally foreign and alien to me. Matt knew an enormous amount about it. He had been one. He had been a conservative intellectual. He could have got a job here.
That's why he came to campus. It was an interview.
Yeah. And even though I hadn't learned anything about it, I had that instinct of what if there's something here? What if I'm missing something? And if I'm just kind of self-satisfied, having stewed in the sort of intellectual and moral political environment that I have, how can I know that without testing, my instincts? I don't know. So but to answer your actual question, does the right feel the same way? I think it's not as much of a problem because the trepidation, this kind of constitutive trepidation of liberalism, of what if we're not right? What if there's something we're missing? I think for many traditions on the right, it's kind of no, we're for sure right.
Yeah.
And we need to win and crush our enemies.
Yeah. For a long time, I'll be open. I'm 43 years old. That's very youthful in the broader world. I just want you to know that. 43 is young. But it is old enough to have gone through a whole period in American political discourse where Fox News arrived and began to dominate. And there was this question asked forever. Now the question is, who's going to be the Joe Rogan of the left? But the question for most of my sort of like early career in politics was, what will be the liberal Fox News? And a radio organization called Air America, where Rachel Maddow got her start, was briefly the answer, and it very tellingly went out of business. And for a while, it seemed like there isn't going to be a liberal Fox News because liberals want their assumptions challenged. And liberals would rather be listening to NPR, where you're getting kind of like you're getting the straight shit, even if you don't like it, and that's what makes us feel good.
A little self-flattering, though.
Yeah. Well, it's absolutely. Yeah. But that's our self-image. That's our self-image, I think. And I don't want to speak. We may not be in exactly the same place sort of on the political spectrum, but I do think kind of part of the sort of identity of being the long-suffering kind of progressive liberal person is just like, well, it's a big world. I might be wrong. I don't know. I really want and I want to get back to some of the media stuff a bit more later, but just to start there and then come back to it. Do you think that's changed at all in terms of people on the left seeking more affirmation and less challenge for their ideas?
I mean, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, but I would say, broadly speaking, the idea that liberals want to be challenged, I think that's like in the mix. But sometimes I worry with the podcast, actually what liberals want is to have a veneer of sophistication on what they already believe. And that's my fear about Know Your Enemy, is we're just doing all this kind of intellectual work that will not really necessarily change someone's mind, but just give them more sophisticated anecdotes or historical references to, stay where they're actually at. So I'm not sure, if Know Your Enemy's our relative success or the fact that, over time we've gained more listeners comes from, I would like to believe, we are informing people and people find it interesting. But in terms of actually like being challenged or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, something that is always interesting to us and that people often ask us about is we do have some conservative listeners. We also have people who, and maybe some of them are here, I hope they are. We do have liberal listeners or leftist listeners who maybe don't even identify as liberal who will write into us and say, I actually started I started feeling conservative about certain things from like kind of understanding the texture of this kind of habit of thought. And there was some writer that we talked about that they went and read, and they were like, actually, this is quite interesting. It's not Ben Shapiro,
right?
But there's a lot more in the tradition other than that.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing we talk about on the show a lot is kind of, there's a conservative disposition, which also has like a moral valence and a political valence, which we all feel
right.
in certain contexts. The feeling of like worrying about things slipping away, grasping for something that is precious, and it's feeling like it's being taken away from under your feet. And that's not that disposition or that kind of preference for the near at hand, the local. Those dispositions don't always produce like, a Republican.
Yeah.
Because you can think of all kinds of moments in the history of the left where what they're fighting for is to preserve some kind of comfort or status, or the labor movement trying to prevent automation, or trying to prevent a factory from closing,
or diversification of the workforce.
Or a great graduate of this institution, one Bernard Sanders, was radicalized when his beloved Brooklyn Dodgers were uprooted and moved out of Los Angeles, right? So that's a conservative reaction. It's something you love that you're feeling slipping away.
Anything can be the trigger. I did date a Republican once, and it was really interesting. It was about the closest I've come to listening to your podcast. Or I should put it this way: listening to your podcast really brings me back. I wouldn't say it was a lot of intellectual debate, and it was a long time ago. But basically, this was a person who her parents had come from the proverbial nothing. Her father had bought a shop. I'm not going to give any identifying information here, and was able to, or he worked at a shop, he was able to buy it, he was able to open more shops, he became a magnate in his state of selling this particular ware, and got pretty rich. And it was the classic, nobody helped me ethos, And sort of layered into that is this, I understand why you want to help people. I understand why the left wants to give things away to people, wants to redistribute. It's just that we've tried it and it doesn't work. And also nobody did it for me and it worked. And when we do it, it doesn't work. And that there's this kind of like corollary where, and we're talking about the sort of the kind of moral valence here, where we can kind of feel sometimes he's kind of wanting to preserve certain things. And we can say like, hey, listen, in my truest heart, I understand the desire to like sort of preserve what we have, or to not waste a lot of government money, or to, anyone who's interacted with the federal bureaucracy, it doesn't turn you into Elon Musk, but you can say like, this is maybe not serving people that efficiently or whatever. But again, you arrive at the same conclusion, which is we've tried your way and it just doesn't work that well. And I feel like for a long time when I was getting started in politics, that was sort of the understanding, was like, at least you knew where the other side was coming from and you were just pretty adamant that it wasn't gonna work. And now I feel like we've arrived at this spot where it's like, totally, you can't even see across the pane of glass. Do you think that is catastrophizing, or do you feel that way?
I don't think that's catastrophizing in the sense that, you can kind of look at the way their kind of political identities and other aspects of their identities, over the past few decades. It used to be you might be like religious and in a union, but also, have other identifying aspects of your identity that, maybe you're more conservative politically, maybe you're, this or that. And it's like there was a jumble and people could be cross-pressured and a little less predictable politically. Yeah. And I think that's why sometimes you'd see, Ronald Reagan winning 49 states in 1984, right? That kind of swing, we just don't, it's almost unimaginable now. And I do think there's a way in which I have some criticisms of the literature of polarization, but there is a way in which people's political identities are becoming more like everything kind of lines up. You go to this kind of church, you have these kinds of social groups you're a part of, this is your political identity, and it all kind of fits. And so I do think kind of people's political identities in that sense are becoming more they're experiencing less day to day in their lives, kind of differences among people, or feeling cross-pressured in different ways. That's part of it. And we just, that is having consequences for how we sort of perceive the political other and how we talk and relate to each other.
You hear people say it feels like a team sport, or politics has become a team sport, where perhaps because people are not feeling impacts, or it takes a long time to feel the impacts of the policy, short of, say, launching a trade war for no reason that empties the shelves at Target. It's like, because I'm not seeing the outputs from the inputs, I just kind of like the Republicans, and those are kind of my guys, and I kind of root for them to own the libs and whatever, and vice versa. And I just wonder, just to bring in your background into this, not to make you,
Sure.
a zoo animal here, but because you grew up in central Pennsylvania, I don't know about central, but in rural Pennsylvania.
Yeah, central Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Blair County, where Donald Trump won in 2020, I think 71 or 72% of the vote in my county, and both of my parents, voted for Trump. So I kind of talking across difference. It's not totally hypothetical to me.
Right. Do you feel like the journey that you went on, which you've described in this seminal essay in Dissent that everybody should check out, do I have that right?
Yes.
Right. Leaving Conservatism Behind, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dissent, summer 2016.
Do you feel like you have other friends from growing up who went on that same journey, but when you look around the landscape of the people you knew as a younger person, people are still dug in ideologically?
There's a number of Know Your Enemy listeners who I think my biographical trajectory is similar to theirs, and that's a major part of our audience, actually, people who are kind of figuring out how to navigate some of this, or asking themselves new questions, maybe if they hadn't asked before. But I see kind of the differences even in my own family. I remember there was a conversation I had with my father in the weeks before the 2020 election. And, I love my dad. We get along still very well. This was extremely unusual and atypical. We were arguing about something. I think he said Biden was going to defund the police. Mm-hmm. I said, Dad, there's no way in hell Biden's going to defund the police. And I heard, click. He hung up on me. And he called me back, minutes later, apologizing profusely. But it was this moment where I was like, I've never had that happen before. It was extremely out of character. And I think it was this little indication of like, yeah, some of the kind of dynamics we're describing here in terms of, people being set in their ways and kind of having, we talk about bubbles and kind of, ideological bubbles, but that's part of it. But just the kind of separation in the sense that I don't really have anything in common, some kind of common ground here from which we could build out a more constructive conversation. I think that's a real part of what's happening now.
Well, I just want to say, because Matt will probably not brag about himself as much as I will brag about him, but I think that the attraction of some of the listeners who have been on some kind of journey from right to left, often it's also that they grew up in a very religious household, and they're figuring out how to, whether to still be religious, whether to practice a particular religion, and whether the kind of morals that they learned in their religious upbringing can actually inform their political decision making as they move from right to left. And Matt's models, I think, on the podcast that you can. You converted from your religion and your politics, but you stayed a Christian. And I think that's something that can be really mooring and helpful for listeners who are on a similar journey. Is that Matt you are cross-pressured, at least in the sense that the prototypical liberal doesn't believe in God and doesn't take any kind of moral instruction from a religious tradition, much less the Catholic Church. But I think that's also in the mix there. And I think one of the things that we try to do, and at our best, I think we're able to. We're not trying to exactly have a debate. That's one thing that people are often surprised about the show is if we have a conservative on, we don't just argue with them the whole time, because we're not good at it and we don't really like it, and we think that you can kind of clarify differences rather than try to win an argument. But I think when we're doing other kinds of episodes, we are trying to kind of find language that is legible across different kinds of political ideologies, or certainly across partisan locked-in partisan divides. Avoid these kinds of stock terms that kind of just shut down people's thinking rather than elevate it.
So, not to let Matt have all the kind of the bio spotlight here. Just quickly, I remember from listening to your intro episode, you're a kid of kind of traditional sort of Jewish Marxist labor politics.
I might have overstated that. I feel like
I'm into it.
I feel like there was one of our profiles described me as a red diaper baby, and my dad was like, "I'm not a communist."
All right, let's take those labels out. But basically, this is a background that's very intelligible to me. It's just sort of academic.
My dad's a labor lawyer. My mom is a legal aid lawyer. He's a union side labor lawyer, so I did grow up around the labor movement.
And this is in the New York area somewhere?
Yeah, Connecticut.
Connecticut, okay. And so you mentioned before, you kind of went through life not having read these texts, which of course I haven't read either. And you also, I'm really interested in this point you made about kind of feeling this, sometimes finding yourself in these positions of sympathy with the enemy, the titular enemy of the podcast, which I know is tongue-in-cheek. What's been the experience in doing the podcast that made you feel most challenged in your orthodoxy?
The true answer is the religious stuff, because I grew up in a faith tradition, sort of, but bagels and lox Jews. We go to High Holy Days. And a Seder.
Yeah.
Hanukkah party.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. That's all you need.
Yeah. Mumble the prayers.
Yeah.
But some of the books, certainly this, but also just knowing that, and that there's this, kind of tradition of moral theology, and that there's, people. I had a conversation just the other day with a friend who was describing a coworker of him he just found out was very religious, and it was like kind of like shaking him up. He was like, "This person's so smart." Like I thought we were always kind of like seeing eye to eye, and same rational basis or whatever. And I was kind of surprised because I was like, "Well, what are you talking about?" Like, But the fact is that the person I talked to most of all and most thoroughly about political questions and moral questions is somebody who does believe, and that
Is that me?
Yeah, you. And that has shaken me up probably the most. The conservative canon, I think probably, I suspected that there were going to be like books I liked, and that it wasn't all going to be just torture to read these books. I think I have been surprised by some of them, just finding the writing to be like a total delight, and that and humor and irony and stuff, which I think I perhaps didn't expect. Actually, it's the left that's kind of humorless. Said the left can be quite humorless, and our books are
it can be
not
very
funny.
boring. Yeah, well, that actually that rolls into my next question, which is, Trump just did this interview, one of his many 100 Days interviews with The Atlantic, where he said, "I'm having fun," and it's easy to be disturbed by that, but it's also manifestly true. And now we can look back at the election and say, like, they were having a lot of fun. I'm going to use we and they. You don't have to, just because I am a former professional Democrat, and I sort of always will be. They're out there having a blast, saying whatever they want, and we've been sort of like fettered by this idea that we shouldn't say the wrong thing and all that. You talk about pretty often in the podcast, like, what it means to be a young conservative in kind of what I'll say loosely was our day, which is kind of like bow-tied, blue blazered, kind of campus martyr who's like sitting alone in the cafeteria with Ayn Rand on his way to the meeting, and he doesn't need to be friends with you because he's thinking real thoughts and nobody accepts him. And that was very much what it was like when I was an undergraduate. And by the way, I do think the persecution and the lack of acceptance was real, and I do think, at least in my undergraduate experience, like, I'll say it, like, I and so many of my friends were like liberal Jews, and it was fine to throw our religion every place, but the minute someone was like talking about Christ, it was like, whoa, we can't have that around here. But anyway, it seems to me that that tradition of young conservatism has sort of been taken over, and that's what you came up in, yeah?
Yes.
But it's now
that describes Matt to a T.
Yeah.
I was like, were we friends when I was younger? How did you know about the Ayn Rand?
Well, I know the pod. And you're so comfortable in the blazer, like I can tell.
I know, I do bear traces of my origin.
Yeah. That has been overtaken by this new young conservative man in particular who's like, it's not a particularly intellectual tradition. And it seems like all of conservatism has been replaced with this kind of anti-intellectual tradition where actually now it's not even being conservative, it's sort of being MAGA, and it's a permission slip to just let rip with your worst impulses. And that there's this kind of uneasy alliance between all those folks and then you're kind of like AEI and Heritage guys who might be writing Project 2025 and really thrilled with kind of having the vehicle to power. But how do you see the landscape, the constellation sort of like, has conservatism been supplanted by sort of red hat Cybertruck people? Or is that a populist surge and the kind of intellectual basis of the right is still there, do you guys think?
That's a really interesting question. And as you were like asking, I was sort of debating that last formulation you offered, because I was thinking there was a way in which like MAGA is way more popular than like anything I was involved in as a 22-year-old young conservative, right? Like being an intern at the Heritage Foundation and reading my Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley Jr., like that was not a kind of popularity-making kind of movement or proposition, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And so I'm partly I'm not trying to be evasive, but I kind of don't know exactly how I would formulate the relationship between something as popular as MAGA and then the kind of intellectual networks I was still, like that still exist that I was a part of 20 years ago. And I would just say, I do think though, I mean, so I would want to distinguish them, but I do think they're, it's not like the intellectuals have just been, keeping on with their work kind of uninfluenced.
Yeah.
And I will say, maybe this is kind of roundabout answer, but I have been not so much surprised, but people, I am old enough now, I'm the same age as you, 43, so I can remember being a 22-year-old. Yeah, I feel young and vigorous.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But when I was a 22-year-old intern, I have thought back, and it's like, I really don't think most of the people I knew, the people I worked with and for, even my fellow interns, we were not talking like MAGA talks now. There has been some change. I've been surprised by some of the people I've known, over the decades to see where they've landed, how they've ended up. So, I think there's been changes, like the character of the intellectual right. Some of it's still the same. Like you can still go on the weekend retreats that Liberty Fund or the Intercollegiate Studies Institute sponsors, right? You can still intern at Heritage or AEI. But I think, it's just the case that Trump and MAGA have they've swallowed so much of the right or influenced so much of it. I'm not exactly sure how I'd tease out the relationship between all the particular parts, but the influence has been noticeable. And I can say that just because, again, I think back, I know what, even in a rosy, rose-colored glasses, looking back, viewing everything more positively than it might have been, I just don't think, I really, really don't think I'm making up that things were not quite as coarse.
Yeah.
Or some of the, what people were talking about substantively was just not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that said, there was something we've talked about on the podcast a lot, and especially at the beginning of the podcast, because we started in 2019. It was a time when there was real kind of competition within the right over the sort of heights of its intellectual institutions between this ascendant populist nationalist wing, as well as, kind of more like theocratic, right of the Christian right, Catholic, integralists kind of people. There was a ferment on the right where there were these people who had felt left out of the intellectual tradition, the post-45 conservative movement, whether because they were paleoconservatives, they were a little more nativist, and they were anti-trade, or if they were sort of these people who felt like the Christian right never got their end of the bargain. We joined up with these libertarian conservatives in the form of fusionism and the Reagan right, and there's still abortion, and obviously sexual mores have gotten worse and worse, and there's gay marriage and blah, 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 blah. So there were these misfit toys of the conservative intellectual movement, which in the Trump moment, and not necessarily because of Trump himself, but in some ways because of what he was breaking open and making possible, they tried to become sort of the hegemonic intellectual part of the right. So there were still intellectuals. They had different ideas, and those people, a lot of them still look like tweedy, bow-tied people. They just believe these different set of ideas that were kind of, in some ways these undercurrents within the intellectual movement of the right, which felt like they hadn't got their day in the sun.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the kind of most useful things the podcast has done in a more practical sense is, just as Sam was describing, it was sort of an auspicious moment when we started the podcast in 2019 because some of the very almost theocratic Catholic conservatives Sam was describing, the integralists, this was when they were really bubbling up. And you had kind of, something like American Affairs, Julius Klein's magazine founded when, not long after Trump won in 2016. You have something like Sohrab Ahmari and Matt Schmidt's Compact, right? It's kind of, you can kind of see it building over the years, and you can trace even some of the conferences where people who, 15 years ago would have been dyed-in-the-wool so-called fusionist conservatives, free markets, social conservatism, and kind of a Reagan-esque foreign policy was the three legs of the stool or whatever, right?
Right.
Like those people, you could see them now showing up to national conservatism conferences, the editor of National Review, Rich Lowry, the editor of First Things, Rusty Reno, like these people who were, loyal foot soldiers in the old conservative movement, you could see in real time, the kind of ship of state of conservatism, slowly turning and charting a different course. And one of the really interesting things about the right is they have the institutional wherewithal to facilitate these conversations and bring people together and kind of get the whole gang together and get everyone on board in a way that I'm not sure I am sure there's no equivalent, I think, on the broad center left to what we saw in the Trump era, especially his first term, watching the intellectuals on the right adapt to what he wrought in the Republican Party and beyond.
Programming question quickly. I meant to ask this at the beginning. Can everybody hear okay? Everyone thumbs up? All right, great.
I'm glad.
I'm glad, because this is a lot to suffer through if you're missing every other word.
I thought there should have been more laughter at some of my jokes.
I know. It's not possible they're hearing me correctly.
Yeah.
So on this point, I think there is probably no better illustration of the evolution and the clash of ideologies within the right than the tortured soul of J.D. Vance. And you guys did a great deep dive episode on our vice president in August, when it was a little bit less scary, marginally less scary to do so. And you really, it seems to me like you see playing out behind his eyes this desire to engage on the kind of like old school intellectual level and just be a MAGA brawler and like get pats on the head from Trump and everybody on Twitter. And I wanted to ask either of you or both of you, kind of like what is your master theory of Vance and Vanceism? And like, is this just one man, or do you think he represents kind of like, are all of the leaders of the party who aren't Trump actually wearing these same two kind of masks?
Well, I think we referred to him on the podcast as Dark Sitman. Basically what would have happened to Matt under slightly different circumstances.
Yeah.
So we're all lucky we're not living under his thumb. I mean, there's so much to say about this. I want to I don't want to do my whole like psychoanalytic theory of J.D. Vance, because you can listen to the podcast. I'll do it.
Can you do a one sentence on it? I think, yeah.
No,
No? Okay.
Maybe later.
All right.
Maybe later, because I want to say something more like
Okay.
about how he represents himself. You can be too paranoid. When your question about does he represent, I think he represents in himself the competing kind of tendencies of the Trump political and intellectual movement, including that his career was funded, his political career was funded by Peter Thiel. He's a venture capitalist and a tech Silicon Valley product in some ways, but he comes from both Appalachia and the Rust Belt. He was a never Trump kind of conservative, holding the kind of more Reaganite view against Trump alive, but then he became the most nationalist populist. Everybody who works for him or talks to people who work for him says he's actually very sophisticated and thoughtful about this suite of ideas that represents kind of the nationalist kind of platform on trade and on social policy and family policy and on immigration. But I think if like J.D. Vance seems like a figure who somehow feels a little like hazy or like contradictory, or like we can't, or like if he has a mental breakdown or something, like there's something about him that I feel like contains the contradictions of this movement.
Yeah.
And the question for J.D. Vance as a person and for the future of the country is whether those contradictions can be reconciled, and then he'll become president for the rest of our lives.
I did think the one thing that was maybe the most interesting to me in Signalgate, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, the group chat discussing the strikes from the Houthis from Mike Waltz and Pete Hegseth, was when Vance weighed in and was like, hey, gang, like, I don't really think this comports with Trump's ideas. Like this benefits Europe way more than it benefits us. We don't really use the Red Sea that much or whatever. And it was like, wow, points to J.D. Vance for actually, he's not the person I would put money on for being the same in the privacy of a group chat that they actually accidentally invited Jeff Goldberg to. And it challenged me for a minute. I was like, oh, actually, maybe J.D. Vance is genuine in his convictions here, but
He's not.
He's not.
He will say anything. I don't think there's a single limit on what he'd say if it advanced his power this much more.
Yeah. Well, but yeah.
I mean, just saying.
We'd applaud that.
I mean, I've been shocked, I think, just by how pliant he's been sometimes. And that moment in the group chat was, I think, just a moment where something he might actually have relatively settled convictions on, foreign policy. It was kind of like, the stop clock moment or something.
The valence of that comment and in that context is kind of hard to read, because maybe he's like, I'm Trump's best little boy, because I know that this intervention actually doesn't comport with what he's saying in Europe about trade policy.
Yeah, well, there was, and as a long ago White House person, you can detect in there with Stephen Miller, I heard the president say we should do thus and such, and everybody's just kind of trying to remind each other, like, well, we were chatting right after you guys left the Oval, and he just kind of said to me that he really wanted to do this.
But I do think the kind of, sometimes you can almost see him calculating, or the sense like going on behind the eyes, like this impulse or that impulse. I mean, I think this follows from what Sam was just describing. He's someone who is desperately insecure and does not know who he really is. And so in any moment, he's thinking, I can say the intellectually coherent thing that will impress my buddies who read Sohrab Ahmari, or I can say the idiotic thing, like, the economy's a department store, that will impress Daddy Trump. And he's constantly having to navigate between, those two impulses of the two main forms of kind of affirmation he currently gets.
And there's something about, have you ever been in a relationship with someone who, when they argue with you, maybe it's a family member, just the kind of person who digs in when you can tell that they dig in when they're not sure of their conviction. And you watch him, it's the tight face and the scolding, and whether it's on the Twitter screeds. And by the way, how does he have time? How does Bukele have time? How does Trump have time? How do these guys have time to be online so much? But just you can, maybe I flatter myself, but I feel like you can see in the tightness there that he isn't sure, which is so infuriating, because just how appealing would it be to the rest of us if he was like, I see both sides of this one, but ultimately it's a tough call, but I think this is the way to go.
Yeah. I mean, we saw during his Senate campaign him kind of feeling his way into being a kind of online MAGA bruiser, which didn't come naturally to him at all. I mean, we talked about on the podcast, which is something about that people-pleasing instinct is that because he's so desperate for approval, he goes too far. It's kind of when you have a friend who's a little bit on the outs of the friend group, and everybody's making jokes, and then they make the joke that's way too far. And J.D. Vance did that on both sides. He called Trump Hitler, right? And even amongst liberals, you're kind of like, okay, he's bad, but and then when he turned to the right, he said Biden is deliberately bringing fentanyl into the country in order to kill Trump voters.
Yeah, that's the thing I'll never be able to forgive. That and the Haitians are stealing the pets and eating them. I mean, it's someone who will say anything.
Yeah, you just stopped me in my tracks. Just remembering the Springfield discourse, I actually my mind derailed for a moment. Yeah, but speaking of election tide, let's move to the sort of the media piece of this. We have survived, we think, this election, and one of the pieces of wisdom we took from it landed us on this panel where we get to talk about podcasting. We all think or agree that this was the podcast election. You guys buy that? Why do you think people want to say that? What do you see about the medium? I'm not asking you to be media critic unless you want to. I welcome it if you do. Of podcasts having all the power right now, and why do you think that illusion might persist, or why do you think it might be true?
First, I can go
podcast election. Well, I mean,
I can elaborate.
no, I know what you mean. We all know what we're talking about. Joe Rogan and the bro podcasters and Trump going on these shows, and Andrew Morantz did that good piece in the New Yorker about this phenomenon. Yeah, I mean, there's an extent to which, like, the kind of the key thing. It used to be that we would say, like, oh, would you want to have a beer with that politician? And now we say, would you want to sit and talk to them for 2.5 hours about absolutely nothing? Or listen to them talk for 2.5 hours about absolutely nothing? I mean, I think that there is, when we were talking about that MAGA culture thing, especially for young people, young conservatives, I think the podcast is like very essential kind of place where that like that popular culture, MAGA popular culture, is being worked out. The reason that Matt and I can be of no help with this is that like we're not a great hang. like the podcast doesn't feel like hanging out with your boys and smoking weed and drinking.
I think it does.
Well,
it's just a different kind of hang.
Yeah.
It's a Chicago
I should say we're
hang.
probably a good hang for you, you nerds.
Yeah.
But I mean that like the idea of like we need a Joe Rogan of the left. I think Hassan, who's coming here, I think he's great. He is that. Yeah. Like I don't know, he seems great. I can't watch that. He seems like really smart and nice, and I can't believe he just like looks at the computer and like for like so hours and hours.
So long. How do you do it?
Yeah, and like he's doing so much. We just like the thing is, it's like we just desperately want to keep being able to have the sorts of conversations that we have. And the instrumentality of those conversations is something that we're always very antsy about.
Yeah.
We're not going to be helpful to the Democratic Party. I'm so sorry. I wish we could be more helpful. I wish the Democratic Party the best. As Trump would say, those people are mad at me, but I'll keep drinking that garbage. When it comes to the Democratic Party.
I do wonder though, just like what, we saw, this is only months ago, really shocking, but we saw Trump. I didn't know who Theo Von was, I'm going to confess that. And then I saw Trump going on Theo Von, and people, particularly the younger people I work with who are more online than me, were like, uh-oh. And then someone was like, yeah, it's like a 3-hour podcast, and I saw that excerpt where Von's talking about coke and the street light and everything.
Trump's like, yeah, that really got you going.
And he's like, what is cocaine like? And you're like,
upper?
Yeah, right, exactly.
As if he'd never been to Studio 54.
Exactly.
But
I do believe
Trump,
he's never
Theo Von should have been like, it's like a diet pill.
Right. But it really worked for him. Were you guys surprised by like, we watch these long, rambling Trump interviews. Maybe you don't. I have to for work. And you're just like, the more it goes on, the more revolting it is, the less sense it makes. This isn't coherent to anyone, and yet the end product seems to be that there's something about being awash in just kind of phrases that people seem to want right now. And Trump does it well. Who else is doing it well? What is it that's happening in these spaces that people need to be doing or not doing?
Sure. Okay, I'll answer this quickly because I know we want to ask some questions. Yeah. But I'll just say, and I think this gets to the Democrat problem, is, you mentioned earlier, like MAGA seems to be having fun.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a way in which, like, the problem with Kamala Harris trying to go on to Joe Rogan and talk for, maybe she wanted to, like, I don't know how that was finally reported out. I'm not blaming her per se. But the problem with that, kind of the idea of that is to kind of just hang and talk for 2.5, 3 hours. I think you have to be comfortable with yourself and really like firm in what you believe. And so, even if you're a jerk, if you go on a podcast and kind of like, are willing to mix it up, defend yourself, say, hey, this is what I believe, and kind of take the hit for that. That's something some Democrats, at least our nominee last time, didn't seem very comfortable doing. And so I think it's a space that kind of reinforces the argument or the kind of comments we've been making already about kind of, the example of the podcast role in this election is, Republicans know what they believe. They might be vulgar, they might piss you off, they might say things you disagree with, but they'll talk about it for 3 hours and they'll let you know where they stand. And that's not, I think, something that Democrats are very good at least many of them right now. And it's something the podcast format, I think, demands of you for it to work, and that's why I think it's working more for the right and Republicans.
Obviously, those podcasts in particular, it rewards just authenticity or the perception of authenticity fundamentally. And one thing about Trump is he is authentic, and the theory that I have about him too, that I recently, I'll do this and then we can do questions. Is
please
remember, Trump has always been so good at Twitter, right? And my theory about why that is that when we got on Twitter, there was that time where you all these journalists, we had to feel like we were cultivating ourselves and becoming brand ambassadors for the company that is me, and there was that kind of felt weird. I mean, you guys may not remember this, but it felt really weird, and there people feel this tension about who am I on the internet versus who I am now, blah blah blah. I think Trump doesn't feel that way. The brand of Trump is who Trump is and has been that way for him for a long, long time. He feels no tension between who he is meant to be in the world and who he feels himself to be. And that is, I think, totally insane, like a desiccated way to live and be in the world. But that is Trump's special sauce in his way of being in social media, and podcasting also is rewarded by that.
And we are going to get to questions in 1 second here, but listening to you guys talk about this so thoughtfully, it's how did he pull off? First of all, I think he is amazing at social media.
Yeah.
When he signs his tweets in all caps, "Thank you for your attention to this matter," it's so good. And you're like, who came up with that? That's awesome. and particularly when it's about the size of, getting rid of the penny or the size of a Big Mac or something.
Yeah.
It's just it's so ridiculous. But he somehow has pulled off what all of us would love to pull off, which is not being expected to have a belief system at all. And so he can sit there for 3 hours and just say stuff, and no one's going to hold him to account because by now we don't expect him to. But yet, if you're Kamala Harris, it's you need to have your sort of 6-point plan. So maybe we just need to believe less. Speaking of convictions, we would love to take your questions. Looks like we have
2 mics.
2 mics.
We're supposed to alternate between them.
We will do our best to alternate. And I don't know if they're staffed or not, but fire away. Yeah, let's do lines. And
I'll kick things off.
yeah, please.
Go for it.
A longtime listener, first-time caller. My name's Eleanor Ford. I'm married to a PhD student in the Cinema Media Studies department, so I'm parasitic to you, Chicago. But I just want to say, I've been listening since 2019, proud Patreon supporter.
Wow.
Thank you.
Really love
Thank
the
you.
program. And I would encourage anyone for whom this is the first time hearing about it, would listen to the whole back catalog. I really admire the work that you've been doing in the recent months, interviewing Waleed Shahid, interviewing organizers in Idaho, interviewing Hayes Davenport, and really talking to people on the ground. And in a certain way, it actually feels like the answer to that long-term question of, or now hard-standing question of how does the left meet the right's media acumen at this point? And it's to speak to the people on the left who are actually winning. And so I'm just interested in your perspective on what it means to talk to more people who are on the ground and to be interviewing people who are doing less cultural production for production's sake and more translating the on-the-ground work and on-the-ground struggle now to a wider public.
I love those episodes. I mean, I think after the election, we had a couple conversations about what we were going to do and how we were going to respond. And one thing was we need to figure out how to do our same kind of, bringing the history of the right into the present stuff with what was going to be a lot of news from the White House. And so we figured out some ways to do that. But the other thing we had talked about was like, well, people are really going to want to have some resources for like fighting back, you know. We've had some of those conversations. You know, that kind of takes me back to more my pre-podcasting journalism career, because I was like, writing for The Nation and always kind of trying to find those activists and political organizers and leaders who are, you know, doing the work really, really well. When we can find people who seem to be doing it in a distinctive way that kind of cuts across some kinds of assumptions we have about how that kind of organizing should take place, then those conversations are really good.
Yeah.
Let's go to this mic. I'm a bad example of this because I do a lot of throat clearing before I ask questions. But let's try to keep the questions brief just so that we can get to as many people as possible, if that's okay. But go ahead.
I mean, do the whole praising us thing.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
There doesn't have to be a question if it's praise. Yeah, that's fine.
Incredible. Hi, guys. I'm Eli. I'm a grad student at the Public Policy School here. And I actually went to undergrad, not to preamble, at Colorado College, where I studied with
yes. One Nate Hockman, perhaps.
played some rugby with a illustrious former guest of yours, Nate Hockman. And I've thought a lot about, he didn't seem like sort of what he's become back then. Obviously, you guys had a chance to talk to him for a little bit. And I wonder, I guess, what you think about or would say to younger sort of conservative-leaning minds who are looking at that either as an example or, as maybe even somebody to follow, considering his, rise and then fall.
I don't know what I'd say exactly, other than, the reason when Nate first reached out to me, sorry for the inside baseball, but I knew his teacher at Colorado College, Tim Fuller, who's like the dean of Michael Oakeshott scholars in the United States and has brought auditions of, Oakeshott's work posthumously. So that was one reason I think I engaged Nate the way I did, is I kind of had this sense of where he was coming from. And, I would just say, and I think I would say this to a real conservative, not being overly even critical or pejorative. I would say something like, there's a lot of money on the right. There's a lot of programs and institutions and fellowships that are pipelines that will, kind of push you one way or the other. And if you're going to pursue those things, I think you should think very clearly ahead of time about what your values are, what you, want out of your career, out of your life, and think hard about, something like being Tim Fuller's student at Colorado College and studying Michael Oakeshott. There are options, doctoral work, academic work. You don't have to necessarily end up working for Ron DeSantis' presidential campaign and, posting Nazi imagery, if that's indeed, what happened. So that would be my thing. I would say there's just a lot of money and incentives on the right that could push you in different directions. And if I were to give a young conservative advice, that's what I would talk to them about.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. It was a really good talk. My question was about the religious right. Sort of the narrative I always heard was that the religious right sort of reluctantly supported Trump to get to these certain policy goals, like banning abortion, but they really didn't like his, character and his brashness. To what extent do you think that narrative is true? The religious right is very reluctant in supporting Trump. Do you think they've become more enthusiastic over time, or how does that shake out?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was more transactional the first time. It's not. What happened over time is that the kind of institutions of the religious right came up with these really satisfying justifications for his kind of like divine providential role in their movement. They used to talk about him being King Cyrus, that he's this figure who is, fallen, but nonetheless plays this incredibly important role in saving our community. And now, the religious, the kind of, very, especially kind of what do we call it, ecstatic religious, evangelical religious right, there are these kind of like prayer, revivals where Trump is like literally an idol, which I understand we're not supposed to do that. But there's that. I think another thing to keep in mind is that the religious right, Trump gave them overturning Roe. And that was like such an organizing principle of that movement for so long. I think something that was really interesting about the most recent election is that Trump kind of in so many words said to them, those of them who are critical of him for not saying he was going to do a federal abortion ban or for him criticizing DeSantis, Trump said to them, I gave you your thing, shut up.
No.
And I think the religious right actually kind of lost some influence during the campaign because they were seen as kind of like wreckers who were unhelpful in trying to put, Trump's message on abortion was moderating of the Republican Party in the most recent election. And so I think that Trump still thinks of it as transactional, and he thinks, I gave you what you wanted. But that's always, I think it's in flux.
Yeah. I'll just, one very quick follow-up to that is, I agree with everything Sam said about that transition. We have seen that shift, but I think one of the other really interesting things is the way Trump has empowered kind of new forces on the religious right, more like charismatic.
Yeah.
Paula White, who runs the White House Faith Initiative, like, she's crazy. You watch clips of her, I mean, she's talking about walking on White House ground that's holy because she's walking on it and casting out demons and, standing up for Trump. And like, that is a very different shift, kind of, who has, from the religious right, has followed in Trump's wake and kind of really glommed onto it. It is a kind of slightly different set of institutions and figures than the classic, like, 90s religious right of Falwell and Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition and so on and so forth.
Hi, I'm David. I'm not a student. I just took the bus here. My question, thank you for the panel. Thank you for the lovely podcast. My question is, what do you think the consequences of debate are? You talked about wanting to not necessarily debate on the show, but have conversations. What do you think about this focus of Ben Shapiro destroying people with facts and logic and Jubilee, 20 conservatives versus one liberal? What's that doing to us, and why is that important?
I hate those videos. They drive me.
Yeah.
I don't even know how people can stand to watch them.
My theory about
sorry.
my theory about them is that those are pornographic videos. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, but those are basically bukkake videos. I think there is something deeply perverse at work in our attraction to we're going to debate all these people one by one, quick. I think it is disgusting. And if you watch that, you need to look in your soul and talk to your psychoanalyst. And we got to stop that. Enough.
Yeah.
Well,
Amen.
Jennifer did say we don't have to hold back, so that was a great example.
I'm always wanting to talk about this.
Yeah. In this room of all rooms. Please.
Hi, Abed, you Chicago law student. My question is about, I think like a really disturbing trend I found sort of in the Biden era going into Trump 2 that I don't know if it existed as much before is it seems like sort of every wing of the right is really into race science now, sort of like quote unquote race realism, whether it's libertarians or like the Vancy, Nick Fuentes protectionist right, whatever it is. Do you think that's just an intensification of a tendency that was always there? Do you think that points to something new? Like, what do you see happening there?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's taking something that was latent all along, but the right was kind of, the earlier version we were describing was kind of, they knew, or they thought they knew, that it would get them in too much trouble if they talked about it. But it's kind of like, okay, if you're a critic of certain welfare policies, certain social policies, because you think they're just never going to work, right? It's like these policies are just not going to help at all. And you start going through the list of like, well, why won't they help? It's like you're going to eventually get down to like, there's just something wrong with these people in their bodies and brains, aka race science, IQ, eugenicist kind of thinking. So I think it's often been a kind of latent aspect of the right social policy. And now, as so many things, they're just kind of like, ripping the Band-Aid off, letting the kind of ugly reality bubble up. And because, they're still winning.
Yeah, and I think this may be obvious to you all, but the reaction to the campaign against structural racism and CRT, critical race theory, was all about eliminating one of those explanations, which is obviously the correct explanation for persistent racial inequality over time. But in order to arrive at the place where the only explanation, which is the one they wanted to arrive at, is there are fundamental racial differences and inheritable intelligence, they needed to eliminate this other, much more complex and huge kind of fascinating and very explanatory kind of tradition of explaining the history of racial inequality.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna try to take 2 or 3 more. We're
Speed
running
round.
a little bit low in time. Yeah, speed round.
Sorry.
Please.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jo. Nice to meet you. My question is, what do you think of Kat Abu-Ghazali's campaign, and what advice would you have for her running a campaign like that?
I'll jump in. I think I'm a big fan of Kat's media criticism. I think she was awesome at Media Matters. I think it's really cool what she's doing. That's not a comment about Jan Schakowsky, whose record I'm not that familiar with. But I am, and I think there is a reasonable discussion to be had about how resources are being used right now, whether it's better to primary ensconced Democrats or to use those resources. Oh, she is retiring now, but thank you. Thank you for the, thanks. But as I'm sure you all have seen, like David Hogg is leading this effort to spend $20 million to primary incumbent Democrats. And I think it's probably fair to say, I mean, she's not here to defend herself, but Schakowsky just kind of saw the writing on the wall that this, it's not fun to go into a campaign where you're being called a dinosaur and all that kind of stuff. I think all those discussions are fair. I don't really know where to come down on them. I think this is one where Democrats can kind of let Jesus take the wheel to evoke the theme of this evening, to say, we don't have to control whether people are primarying each other or not. If people want to primary people, they should do it, and we'll figure it out. I think where there is genuine energy and it's being used for positivity and it's being used, I think I saw Kat said recently, after Schakowsky said she was going to retire, anyone should get in. People should get into the race. I think that is if nothing else, it's got something we are generally lacking right now, which is the ability to attract attention. And I think, I'm not trying to reduce her to that. I think she's a lot more than that. But I just think hey, she's grabbing some attention for doing something audacious, and she's talking about what she believes in, and I think that's great.
Hi, my name's James. I'm a student at the Harris School of Public Policy, longtime fan of the podcast. And about the podcast, it is sometimes an interview podcast, but it's usually like a book club. You guys do a lot of reading of these authors, and I'm wondering, who do you think is the best prose stylist, best writer of the conservative authors you've read, and how does their skill at writing affect the sort of persuasiveness of their ideas?
That's a tough question. I was going to be, a little bit of a jerk and say the best conservative writer I've ever read is Gary Wills, and he moved left, of course, although he still called himself a conservative. But I would say among the living, people writing right now, I think Sohrab Ahmari is a very good writer. Both, I do take him seriously intellectually, and I actually find his prose is often, quite good. And I actually kind of like Ross Douthat, too. I read Ross a lot, and I know this is the most boring answer possible.
Guilty
of
pleasure.
course, a left-wing podcaster's favorite conservative read is Ross Douthat. But I actually do read both of them, and it's in part because they're very readable.
Yeah. Nice Willie Nelson shirt.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sweet.
Hi, thanks for doing this talk. I'm Allison, and I'm a grad of the college. I also took the bus here.
All right.
Yay for public transportation.
They walked, so you're among friends.
There
Yeah.
solidarity.
Yeah, that's right.
I was curious about returning to the question of authenticity that y'all had sort of gotten to near the end of the conversation, and in particular, coming back around to the idea of like, what does left-wing authenticity look like? This is sort of fodder for Sam, but I know that like Todd McGowan and the sort of Lacanian psychoanalytic tradition has talked about like left and right-wing forms of enjoyment, and the way that we just talked about Trump, I think that there's an appeal to someone like Hassan in that like pugilistic style, but I also know that for myself, like listening to y'all, there have been these moments of, I guess, like moral clarity and things like that that feel like moments of, in your own critiques, left-wing, authentic left-wing moments of like, wait, this is fucked up. Like, these guys want to fuck people over or whatever. So I'm curious, I guess, both in keeping of there being this new sort of wave of people who are going to be pursuing elected offices, as well as thinking in terms of the media landscape, what does authentic leftiness look like to you, and how can people embody that?
I have a very short answer.
I'm not going to touch the Lacan
that won't
part
get
of
to everything. But I was thinking about, in an age of diminished expectations, right? I was just, after Pope Francis died, I was rereading his document Fratelli Tutti, and so much of it is about like diminished dreaming, like diminished expectations. And I sometimes think the authentic sort of enjoyment people on the right get out of cruelty is like, well, if there's nothing else on offer, if we don't think our lives are actually going to get better, at least we're going to take some enjoyment out of the cruelty we see.
But cruelty also, it takes place in the realm of fantasy.
Well, I'm just saying, I think one of the tricky things, any authentic left-wing movement I would want to be a part of does not have those options available to us. And the dilemma is partly, to quote actually a great singer from Chicago, Mavis Staples, one of my heroes, the only weapon with which we have to fight is love. And that is a strategic disadvantage, I would say.
Yeah, I know we got to wrap up. I will just, not to just plug our show gratuitously, but we recently had Congresswoman Sarah McBride on, who is an amazing icon, in my view. And she was talking about this idea that I don't think is original to her, but that basically people see Republicans, the right enjoys the advantages of that men enjoy in society, which is not really having to be faithful, not really having to live up to their word, and that and they can kind of say they can get a little bit drunk and kind of say shit, and that when Democrats were the moms, we're the women, and that when we complain, it's shrill and all that, and we're expected to kind of uphold everything, and it really was like, it was a little gutting to hear. But she made this point about like when can we be strong and authentic? It's when we're defending our flock. And that's the moment that we're in right now, is Democrats being like, okay, fuck the like Joe Rogan of the left question right now. Like, we are at a moment where people are getting disappeared to gulags, and we all know that we're not going to stand for this in our country. And we have authentic rage about that, and that I don't think the only form of left-wing authenticity can be rage about justice or institutions, but it is a good way to get in touch with that feeling of being happy warriors and people who aren't afraid to say what we believe, which is maybe as good a place to end it as any. I did want to ask you guys one final question.
Yeah.
In the spirit of sort of, James Carville's like apocryphal post-it note with it's the economy stupid, whatever. As we all go out into the night here, we're engaged in what feels like a really important struggle for our civilization. It can feel like that sometimes. Day to day, it's a more tactical thing about trying to survive against a right-wing machine that's very scary. What is your post-it note advice to people on the left about what to remember about the right as we go forward?
Okay, you want to?
I don't know. I'm thinking.
The thing. I was reminded of this because we did the Pope Francis episode recently, and sort of both felt, in different ways, He wasn't as important to me. But both felt that there was a passing out of the world, a kind of a message, a figure who represented this kind of gentleness and this kind of forwarding of the fragility of human beings. And I think we come back to this on the podcast all the time, is that just don't lose sight of the fact that, and don't rage against the fact that you are fragile and dependent on other people. That's easier said than done. People go to therapy for a long, long time to get over the fact that they resent their dependence on others. But I don't think there's any future for the left that does not acknowledge basically frailty and gentleness.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, Matt, Sam, thank you guys so much. Thank you all. Thanks, Reid.